Namaste. Nirakula is a yogashala which firmly believes in
निराकुल केन्द्रं कुत्र अस्ति?
बेंगलूरु नगरे अस्ति।
इन्द्रानगरे
HSR लेआउट मध्ये अस्ति।
शोभनं स्थानम् एतत्। शोभनं स्थानं।
शोभनं स्थानं।
बृहद् अस्ति।
बृहद् नास्ति, बहु लघु एव भवनं, परन्तु तत्र जनाः अधिकाः, ततः दृश्यते। तत् सर्वं भवनं न, अन्यत्र कुत्र तेषां कार्यक्रमः।
एवम्। ओ कार्यक्रमः यत्र क्रियन्ते तत् तानि
सत्यं। योग दिनसन्दर्भतया केचन कार्यक्रमाः कृताः।
एवम्।
एतत् तेषां भवनम्।
एषः मुख्याध्यापकः
किम्?
यः एषः मुख्याध्यापकः तत्र मुख्य योगाचार्यः किं तत्र?
चरण अहं न चरणः अमरेशः इति। ते यदि वीडियो बन्नी ಒಂದ್ಸಲ चरण अमरेश, introduce yourselves. So this is Amaresh.
Sorry, I can't.
So he is the founder.
नमस्ते जी, चरण महोदय इति।
Where is Charan?
एषः अमरेश महोदय अस्ति।
एषः अमरेशः। चरणः चरमे आगच्छति।
तर्हि अत्र शिक्षकप्रशिक्षणमपि प्रचलति इदानीम्।
एते चालयन्ति।
एवम्। एषः चरणः सः।
चरणः अमरेशः उभावपि चालयतः।
चित्रे द्वौ अपि आस्ताम्।
सत्यं। तेषाम् अभ्यासः अपि बहु समीचीनः अस्ति।
कुतः एतद् एस्व्यासतः उतः अन्यतः?
न, एस्व्यासतः न। एते देयर अ ब्लेंड ऑफ मैसूर्स पट्टाभिजोयस् ट्रेडिशन एंड लिटिल बिट ऑफ शिवानंद।
एवम् उत्तमम्।
परन्तु तेषां या गतिः अस्ति अधुना, सा तु गतिः, तत्तु चलनमस्ति, समग्रतया शास्त्रमार्गे एव अस्ति। अतः एव तादृश कार्यक्रमान् ते योजयन्तः सन्ति।
शोभनम्।
एवमस्ति, समग्रतया तद् गुरुकुलं भवेत् इति ते प्रयतमानाः सन्ति।
एवम्। भवतः तत्र सत्त्वम् अस्ति, सत्त्व भवतः संस्था अस्ति।
तत् सत्त्वम् अधुना निस्सत्त्वम् अस्ति। तत्र मम किमपि नास्ति तत्र इदानीम्।
एवं वा?
ते पृष्टवन्तः, अतः मम संस्थायाः नाम सूचितवान्। अस्तु, इदानीम् इन्वोकेशन् अस्ति, प्रार्थना।
गणानां त्वा गणपतिगुं हवामहे कविं कवीनामुपमश्रवस्तमम् ज्येष्ठराजं ब्रह्मणस्पत आरः शृण्वन्नोतिभिः सीदसादनम् महागणपतये नमः। ॐ नमो प्रातपतये नमो गणपतये नमः प्रमथपतये नमस्ते स्तुलम्बोदरायैकदन्ताय विघ्ननाशिने शिवसुताय श्रीवरदमूर्तये नमः। ॐ प्रणो देव देवी सरस्वती वाजेभिर्वाजिनीवती धीनामवित्र्यवतु चोदयित्री सूनृतानां चेतन्ती सुमतीनां यज्ञं दधे सरस्वती वाग्देव्यै नमः। ॐ शम्भवे नमः। नमस्ते अस्तु भगवन् विश्वेश्वराय महादेवाय त्र्यम्बकाय त्रिपुरान्तकाय त्रिकाग्निकालाय कालाग्निरुद्राय नीलकण्ठाय मृत्युञ्जयाय सर्वेश्वराय सदाशिवाय श्रीमन्महादेवाय नमः। ॐ ये अर्वामुतवा पुराणे वेदं विद्वागुं समभितो वदन्त्यादित्यमेव ते परिवदन्ति सर्वे अग्निं द्वितीयं तृतीयं च हगुंसमिति यावतीर्वै देवतास्ताः सर्वा वेदविधिब्राह्मणे वसन्ति तस्मात् ब्राह्मणेभ्यो वेदविद्भ्यो दिवे दिवे नमस्कुर्यान्नाश्लीलं कीर्तयेदेता एव देवताः प्रीणाति।
Over to Swarna.
Namaste. A very warm welcome to one and all on this fourth day Navratri Chitta Shuddhi celebrations. I am delighted to welcome one another special speaker, Dr. Anuradha Chaudhary, who is a professor of humanities and social sciences at IIT Kharagpur. She teaches Sanskrit, Indian psychology, French, and a course on mind and language sciences as a part of history of science and technology in ancient India. Dr. Anuradha is a highly motivated Sanskrit scholar dedicated to revealing the deeper secrets of Vedas and promoting Sanskrit as a living, modern, spoken language. She also seeks to create awareness about the power of sounds from thoughts to languages in our lives, with a special emphasis on the transformative power of Sanskrit sounds, which can serve as an aid to a more peaceful and healthier individual and collective living. In 2019, she was awarded the first ever Young Teachers Award for the contribution to the Institute. Her Sanskrit classes are most sought and well attended by students, especially in the Technical Institute. After her PhD in Sanskrit in Vedic psychology under Dr. K.E. Dharanidharan from Pondicherry University, she received the prestigious Erasmus Mundus Scholarship of the European Union. She has mastered Italian and French amongst many other languages. An alumni of Sri Aurobindo International Center of Education, Puducherry, she also travels across the globe to deliver lectures and conducts workshops at national and international organizations. She has delivered a talk at Annual Yoga Congress of European Union of Yoga in Switzerland. Recently, along with Dr. Vinaya Chandra, who was the speaker yesterday, she co-curated the 41 days of Yoga Town Global Festival of Yoga, celebrating wellness, which was organized by Indica Yoga. As a volunteer with Samskrita Bharati, Dr. Anuradha is an active advocate of spoken Sanskrit and has conducted many short-spoken Sanskrit programs in India and abroad. Her works have been published in various journals and has co-authored books titled Perspective on Indian Psychology and Happiness, Indian Perspective. Today, Dr. Anuradha is going to take us through Ritambhara Prajna, the key to liberation. Once again, our Purvaka Suswagatam.
Namaste, Bhagini, and thank you very much for a very generous introduction. There's just one small thing that I would like to probably modify in what you said about what I received the award. The award is given in the institute earlier also. I was just fortunate to be the recipient last year. I thought this for the record, it's good that I put that in the right perspective. I would also like to thank you for your very warm welcome. I'd like to thank Swarthyaya for the invitation, to Amreshji, Charanji for having given me this opportunity to share a few insights on this very important topic of Chitta Shuddhi, which in today's world is plaguing all of us in various ways, and more so because the present reality of uncertainty that the pandemic has left us all in is forcing us to look at ourselves more than ever before and to put our attention on the inner world while we have been running around and outsourcing our life and our life energy to everything around us. This is a great opportunity for us to turn inside and to start understanding how we are perceiving the world around us. So just to briefly work, for I'll just do a small salutation of offerings to the offering to the masters, and then I'll proceed. Shri Guru Bhyo Namaha Hari Om. So I also consider it a good fortune to speak after.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, audio is not clear, ma'am.
Hear me?
Yeah, now it's better.
Can you hear me? Wait, I think I will just give me a second then. 1 second.
Yeah.
This is perfect, ma'am.
This is good. Yeah.
Is this better now?
Yes, ma'am. Perfect.
Better now? Yeah. All right. So I just wanted to. I was just mentioning that I think it's also a very good fortune of mine to be talking after three very erudite scholars who have laid the bhumi for whatever I'm going to say today. The topic that I've chosen is a topic which is very dear to my heart, and it's a topic that I've been doing a lot of thinking about for a certain while. So I'll try and make it a combination. I will try and, in fact, demystify a little bit this topic of Ritam, and try and make it accessible in a manner that you can comprehend and also apply in your daily lives, because the topic itself has a very vast scope. It says, Ritambhara, Prajna, the key to liberation, and it's something that all of us would be very interested to understand more about, obviously. So this is a term that I first came across during my PhD on Vedic psychology at Pondicherry University. And my background was more from the Sri Aurobindonian perspective, where I encountered this term when I was looking at the psycho-spiritual understanding of the Vedic texts. Sri Aurobindo, in his personal sadhana, had a certain direct understanding of the Vedic story. And when he read the text, he then understood that these texts were actually documenting the psychological or the psycho-spiritual experiences that he was undergoing. And therefore, he concluded that the Vedic texts get their depth and understanding when you attribute to these texts their deeper symbolic sense. And in order to arrive at the deeper symbolic meaning, he said that there are certain key words. If one knows how to interpret those keywords from the psycho-spiritual perspective, then one starts understanding what the Vedic quest was all about. So, in simple terms, one of the things that he also adds, he says that when one gives a certain translation or an interpretation more so to these Vedic terminologies, we have to remember that the truth that they're talking about is reflected at various levels. So, one of the important worldviews that the Indian civilization represented was the understanding that truth is not just a monolithic truth, but truth is getting translated into various layers of existence. And each of these layers has its own laws, and each of those laws, therefore, need to be understood. If one understands the laws of that world, then we can operate in those worlds in the best way possible. So it was very important to get clarity of what are these understanding laws of each of these different layers of existence, because based on those laws, we can then enact our lives, the result of which would be give us the greatest benefits. So in the Vedas, he refers to these different layers of the worlds, or the Vedas themselves talk about it, and then Sri Aurobindo gives it its deeper psychological meaning. But he says that in the Vedas, they are referred to as the Vyahritis. And what are these Vyahritis? So they are the Bhur, Bhuva, Swaha that we chant before reciting the Gayatri mantra and some other mantras as well. And then we talk of the Mahar, the the Jana, the Tapa, and the Satya. Excuse me. So, if we understand that these are the 7 layers, the 7 worlds, he says that the concept of Ritam, which is one of the key words of the Vedic lore, he says if you want to get an understanding about the deeper investigations of the Vedic rishis, one has to be able to tap into the inner meaning of the term Ritam, especially. So the term Ritam, he says, is associated with the layer of Mahar, okay, or Mahas. And then he says that this arrangement of the Vyahritis in the Vedic lore finds its reflections in the more psychological recognition of the different worlds in the Vedantic and the Puranic traditions. So, in the Vedantic traditions of the Upanishads, etc., they refer to these different worlds as the different koshas of the Purusha and the different lokas thereby. So you have the Annamaya kosha, the Pranamaya, the Manomaya. Then he talks of the Vijnanamaya kosha. And from the Vijnana, then you have the Satchid Ananda. When you split them up into the 3, so the Anandamaya kosha, which is composed or which consists of the 3 together, or the Satchit Ananda. So we have these 2 things. So on one side, you have the Vedic Vyahritis, which in the Puranic worlds becomes the different koshas, the theory there. That then in the Yoga Sutras becomes the understanding of the relationship between Purusha and Prakriti, and the concept of the Mahar fits into the Mahar of the, the Mahat and the Buddhi. That layer, all these layers seem to be corresponding to each other. And what Sri Aurobindo says is that in the Vedas, when they talk of Ritam, they also talk of it as Ritam Brihat. So these 2 words go together. So they understand what is Ritam. In the Yoga Sutras, the term Ritam is used as, it comes in the sutra, which is the 49th sutra, and this sutra just precedes. This sutra is the 48th sutra, sorry, it's the 48th sutra, and it says, Ritambhara Tatra Prajna. This intelligence or this awareness that one arrives at when he's describing the states of samadhi, this awareness is that which just precedes the experience of nirbija samadhi, or the absolute quietening of the mind, and the experience of oneness with the Purusha, or rather the reflection which allows the mind to reflect the Purusha fully. So we have this, the position of the Ritambhara Prajna. So Ritambhara Prajna, the definition of that, or the elaboration of that in the Bhashyam, is he says, Tasmin Samahita Chittasya. So just the verse before that, or the aphorism before that, the sutra before that says, Nirvichara Vaisharadye Adhyatma Prasadaha. So he's saying that in the state of Adhyatma Prasada, which happens with Vaisharadyam. So what is this Vaisharadya? He says that is when the Ashuddhi of the mind, the impurities of the mind are contained. How are they removed? They removed when the Rajas and Tamas are reduced, when the noise and the movements of these two qualities are reduced in us. Then there is a sattva shuddhi or a buddhi which attains a more of a sattvic quality, and with the coming of the sattvic quality, it allows a kind of a experience of samahita chitta, where the chitta is in a state of a certain quietude. That awareness that comes about as a result of that quietude is what is referred to as Ritambhara Prajna. And Ritambhara Prajna, very literally from the terminologies, means that awareness which is full of the concept or consciousness of the Ritam. So coming back again to Ritam, the term Ritam itself, if you go to the etymology, comes from the root Rit, and Rit means the right. So the moment we talk of right, we are referring to right in connection with something else. We can't just say right like that. The moment you say something is right, it implies intrinsically that there is a standard. There is a standard against which this right is being spoken. So, what are those standards that are being referred to in this context? And why is it that one doesn't have access to those understandings of the right in our normal circumstances? So, I had a certain drawing that I will try and present before you, or I will try and probably draw something out for you to help you understand the way I put these things together. So, I'll try and share a picture here with you. I'll just. So if we look at the world in terms of let's say the fact that from Purusha, the witness consciousness, we have Prakriti that has emerged, and or rather Prakriti is a separate entity which is there, and Prakriti is giving rise to the different aspects and manifestation. From her, manifestation is emerging. So in the Sankhya philosophy, Prakriti herself is not considered to be sentient. So in the creation, we have a manifestation that is taking place. So I normally like to represent this manifestation in terms of a certain, let's say in terms of a certain movement. So I'll draw it out as a wave. Okay, so we have a certain wave-like formation, which is, let's say, the ideal. So Prakriti, as she is first coming into evolution, when she's creating the evolutionary process, the original layers of her manifestation, the Mahar layer of the manifestation, contains the blueprint of the ideals of things. It is then when it breaks up into ahankara, mana, the tattvas, etc., that there is a loss of the translation of the original insight of things. So I would like to represent the Mahar layers as something which has the same vibratory nature. It knows, it has the same kind of a frequency as the original pattern. But then what invariably happens is as manifestation unfolds. So with the coming in of ahankara, with the coming in of mana, with the coming in of the jnanendriyas, with the coming in of the karmendriya, the tattvas, the mahabhutas, as manifestation is happening, there is, like I said, a loss of the connection with the original source of things, more so. And there is a complexity that is building. And in that complexity, what is typically happening is I will represent the manas. Let's keep it as a manas which is still Shuddha manas. Okay, so the Shuddha manas still retains those frequencies but of a different nature. Then you have, as we go down into the different layers, I will represent the layer of the pranamaya kosha, or the layer of bhuva, or the layer of bhuvaha, in this manner. And then when we go further down into the layer of the bhur, it's matter, the layer of matter, which is very dense. I'm representing it in terms of the density of it. Now, what typically happens is that this is a possible system. When we are coming into creation and we are looking at the human being, we are looking at the human being as a system with these different kinds of vrittis that are possible, with these different kinds of movements that are happening within the consciousness of the individual. Okay, but these movements are not in their pure form, which will allow the reflection of the Purusha to be there, or the Drashta to fall on the rest of the Chitta. So as Vinaya and all the other speakers have told before me, the Chitta Bhumi that we have, the different states of mind that we have different qualities. So the first kind of quality is that it is it is kshipta, which means it is distracted, it is full of action. So if I have to do a representation of that from the point of view, from this point of view, I would represent it as something which is, let's say, in this kind of a noisy structure. Okay. Further down, this gets even more noisy with the mudha. With the mudha, it's really very, very dense. It's full of the different vrittis that are um, clouding its awareness, that are clouding its understanding of the reality that it lives in. So in the Yoga Sutras, the first sutra that tells us that what therefore is yoga, yoga is nothing but how do we stop all these movements? How do we go from mudha and kripta to vikshipta? A little, I mean, still has the noise, but it is moving towards moments of clarity. From there, we have to go to a state of greater ekagrata, a greater degree of focus. From that greater degree of focus comes a certain state of a stoppage or a niruddha. Okay, so that is the movement of the consciousness within, the movement of the vrittis within us. So if we look at the different vrittis that are spoken of, so we have largely the Yoga Sutra talks of the two, which are the klishta and aklishta. First and foremost, they do that kind of a division. They talk of the five vrittis, of course, but then they say that largely, broadly, they fall into these categories of the klishta, the complex, or the simple, the aklishta. So they say that the more we engage in thought patterns that carry or that have these long trains of extra patterns with them, the more we will be, the more our mind stuff, the chitta, will be deluded and crowded with things that are happening there. And the noise, the movement in the water, let's say, is troubled. And the reflection of the Purusha or the Drashta will not be cleared. So how do we then start clearing it up? So Vinaya talked of various methods. Even Jairamji the other day, of Jairam Bhrata, talked of different methods. Pennaji also spoke of different methods by which we can gradually help to quieten this different noise within us. What is the consequence of reducing the noise within us? So the more we are able to um, observe, first and foremost, gradually we start observing these different patterns that we have. How do we start observing it? We start observing it using abhyasa and vairagya. It's also important to understand what these abhyasa and vairagya are doing. I would like to, I'd like to, in a sense, mix certain disciplines and try and present this idea. So when we are talking of abhyasa from a very neuroplastic point of view or neuroscientific point of view, when we are following certain patterns in the mind, those patterns are creating certain neural pathways. If those neural pathways are reinforced, then that becomes our spontaneous automatic reactions to the world. When those neural pathways, if we want to break those neural pathways, first and foremost, one has to start establishing alternative pathways. How does that alternative pathway start happening? It happens through the process of abhyasa. Abhyasa of what? Abhyasa of the yamas, the niyamas, gradually moving from a greater degree of complex thought patterns to more simplified and clarified thinking is what will allow a new kind of formation to happen, even with the neural patterning that we're doing in the head. So with abhyasa, we are creating alternative possibilities of action, and those alternative possibilities need to be strengthened. The other quality that the Yoga Sutra recommends is the idea of Vairagya. So what is Vairagya doing? I mean, just before that, with the abhyasa itself, as the all the speakers have said before me, so it's dirgha kala. So there has to be consistency, because if you're thinking of something and then you're doing something else, then the neural pathways that are forming are not going to be consistent and embedded or anchored within the brain patterns. So dirgha kala, nairantare. So it has to be sustained. It has to be continuous. Satkara. So there has to be a lot of goodwill, because one of the other tendencies that happens, which Jairam Bhrata also talked about, is the baggage that happens when you start blaming yourself. There is a guilt that happens when you say, oh, I'm not being able to do that. This is not right. And when that guilt starts coming upon oneself, then one is no longer able to do the action for the sake of doing the action. One gets carried away by the noise that is accompanying that action or that thought. So in this case, one has, the moment one does the Dirgha Kala, Nairantarya, Satkara, Sevita, Dridha Bhumi. So when one establishes that kind of a practice, steady practice, one has to also accompany it with Vairagya. And Vairagya is that which doesn't allow the mind to get captured. So it's a vitrishnasya, which means that although it is engaging in certain actions, it is not, there is no hankering after the results of that. There is no hankering after the attachment. There is no longing and holding on with whatever our senses are engaging with, because the reality is that we are engaging with the world. The reality is that we are taking recourse to different things when we are leading our lives. So how do we engage in the world and not allow the world to leave every single imprint on our mind that crowds our system and makes it into a moodha condition, is what is recommended. So abhyasa and vairagya. So with the consistent application of abhyasa and vairagya, we are able to move from a more noisy or a moodha structure to the kshipta, vikshipta, then the ekagra, a greater degree of concentration. Now, in this whole dialogue, where does the concept of Ritam fit in? So Ritam is the understanding of what is the right. It's getting a clarity of what is the true patterns of things. So as I said earlier on, it is in the, when the chitta is no longer um, it is no longer crowded by the tamasika and the rajo qualities. So in this drawing of mine, I could represent the noisy pattern as the tamasika patterns, and the lesser ones as the rajo. So there is movement and all, but still it allows the possibility for a greater degree of clarity to come in. When that happens, then there is a greater degree of what I say, the alignment and the reflection of the satya, the patterns of the truth, can happen on the chitta consciousness of the individual. So the chitta bhumi starts becoming a reflector of the original, the purusha consciousness, or let's say even the drashta starts looking at itself, or the drashta is being able to establish itself in the individual consciousness. The Yoga Sutras then goes on to say, it says, Shrutanumana Prajnabhyam Anya Vishaya Vishesharthatvat. So what does it say is that when this kind of a knowledge emerges, when you have this Ritambhara awareness, the consciousness of what is right, then the consequence of that awareness is that, or rather, one of the direct applications of that is that the knowledge that you get is a different kind of a knowledge. It's no longer the knowledge which is dependent on what do I think about it, what have I heard about it. It is not dependent on a different medium to give access to it. The Ritambhara consciousness has direct access to knowledge of the truth of things. And therefore, Sri Aurobindo in the Vedas, he calls it, when he's giving it its psycho-spiritual meaning, he says that if you understand Ritam to be the dynamic truth in action, then we are approaching the real sense of what the term Ritam means and how it can become a helpful state of consciousness to enable us to experience greater degrees of liberation. So coming back to the drawing itself, what exactly is Ritam in this picture that I have here? So Ritam is the awareness of the Satya. So in that Samahita Chitta, in that consciousness where the being has become quiet, or rather the mind has quietened down, there is an understanding, there is the intuitive understanding, or one has a direct glimpse of the truth of things, the laws of the workings of the universe. So when one has access to the laws of the working of the universe, then supposing this is the kind of a pattern, or that's the tune that one has to play in the universe, because each one has come here with a certain swadharma, uh, a certain law of action for each life story. So there is a kind of a blueprint of the ideals of our independent existence, but we lose track, or we don't have access to those understandings of the blueprint, because we are not in connection. We don't have the means to know what they are. And why not? Because the mind is clouded by what it thinks it should do, the past memories it has, the future expectations that it has, the nidra, the five vrittis. The five vrittis come in and they obstruct our direct perception of truth in itself. So, for example, what happens in that case is, if you have, if I represent this pattern here as the Satya, the pattern of truth, that which exists, under normal circumstance, what happens in life? Because we don't have access to that truth, we make a pattern which is very random. So supposing I have to be here at this time, because of the rajoguna and the tamoguna, which are consequences of, I would say, the different kleshas that we have, our attachments, first and foremost, the ignorance, the avidya. We don't know what things are. We keep mistaking the temporary for the permanent. We keep mistaking that which is non blissful for the blissful or the pleasurable. So how do we go beyond that? So that the asmita being one of the first, not asmita, ajnana being one of the first kinds of obstacles, main obstacles that stops us from knowing satya for what it is. The second one is asmita. We think, the ego part of it, we think that this is what is true, and therefore we act on that basis. The third, of course, is the raga, dvesha, where we are carried away by, we are swayed in our perceptions by our likes and our dislikes. And finally, the fears that prevent us from living our lives in the best way possible. So, in this case, when you have the satya, instead of at that particular point following the satya pattern, we tend to make a pattern which is somewhere there at the second point, at this point of our lives, supposing at this point of our lives, instead of following that pattern with, we might do something like this. At this point, instead of maybe doing this, we are doing something like that. So the pattern that we end up emulating in our lives, or rather we end up following in our daily existence, is something of this kind. So we are constantly creating this extra noise in our structures for the simple reason that we do not have access to the original patterns, and we do not have access to those original patterns because of the clouded mind that we have. And why is that mind clouded? Because of the vrittis, the kleshas, and that whole story. So what is Sri Aurobindo saying in his interpretation of the term Ritam as dynamic truth in action? He says that if this is the truth, then one has to be able to replicate it identically. So if this is Ritam, then, I mean, if that is the Satya, then Ritam, which is in manifestation. So in manifestation, at all the levels of the manifestation, at the level of the Ahankara, at the level of the Manas, are we able to replicate the original patterns of the first Prakriti that was there? So are we able to reflect that? And the more we are able to do that, then the result is a kind of a brihat that follows. So this layer where Ritam is supposed to be the dominant feature is characterized by the experience of Brihat. What happens with this experience of Brihat? With the experience of Brihat comes many other things. So One of the first consequences of that is the natural experience of a bliss. Another very important thing that follows as a result of this is that when we are, in a sense, pursuing Anritam, which means that instead of being at this point, I am there. This extra movement that one has done is the creation of that extra baggage or the karma phala. This is the extra karma. So if I have to give you another analogy, in another analogy, it's like if you are driving a car and there is a highway. So if you want to go from your home to your particular destination, there is the shortest route, there is the clear route that is possible, which I will refer to as the highway. So the whole purpose of creation, according to the Sankhya thing, is also how do the different gunas stop in the individual, so that Prakriti can stop her movement and Purusha can be fully established in the witness self, in the individual as well. So it allows the full reflection. Prakriti becomes so still that she can allow the full awareness of Purusha to be on her. But what is happening is that because of the noise of Prakriti, this there is a deviation from the original, and that deviation of the original is what I understand as the karma. The extra karma leaves its samskaras, that those samskaras in tune with the are not in tune with the, let's say, the neutral impulse of the individual. So when we are creating these extra samskaras, those have tendencies. Those tendencies are driven by, again, the raga and dvesha that we have. So those tendencies again generate new karma, and we are forever stuck in that whole karma vipaka ashayai kind of a circuit that is there. Why does that come about? Because the path that we are following is more of anritam. So in the Yoga Sutras, there is a recommendation that how do we start quietening our system so that we have greater and greater access to the Ritam within us. And when the Ritam starts emerging, when we have the Ritambhara Prajna, they say that another consequence that follows is that it is Tajjah Sanskaraha Anya Samskara Pratibandhi. What happens as a consequence? So it says that the samskara that comes, so it's not that there is no samskara, because when we are acting with Ritam, there is still some kind of a samskara which is being formed in our consciousness. But what is the nature of that samskara? It doesn't result in extra noise. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you have this particular frequency here and Ritam is following that identically, then there is no extra deviation. There is no extra route that you have to go and you have to come back and all. One is just following the uh, one is just following the original pattern of the Satyam. And with that original following of the pattern of Satya, then we are experiencing a spontaneous state of not creating any extra samskaras that are there. And we are following just the pattern of the original Satya, which then leads to the experience of the Nirbhija Samadhi. So, from a state of a noisy, from the state of a kshipta and mudha consciousness or awareness, we have to gradually quieten down all of that using all the different techniques. One of the important techniques that was spoken about by Vinayji yesterday was Ishwara Pranidhana. Many. So the first one was Tapas, Swarthyaya, and Ishwara Pranidhana. So tapaha is when one is ready to recognize that, recognize more and more what is the rhythm of anything. Or how can one start doing what we know is right rather than follow or get carried away or get swayed away by our other tendencies. So the more one, by exercising tapas, is able to follow the right action, the more one is able to follow that right action by Ishwara Pranidhana, which is by a surrender of oneself. And what is when the process of surrender really happens? One of the things that enables surrender is the recognition that what I think is not necessarily the path. I have to be able to quieten that and surrender to the higher consciousness, which is klesha karma vipaka, free of all of that. So the more I'm able to surrender to to a force that is aware of that reality, the more I will allow my chitta shuddhi to happen. The more chitta shuddhi happens, the more I will have access to Ritambhara Prajna again. The third thing that he says is Swarthyaya. So, with the practice of Swarthyaya, again, one is able to identify within oneself the different movements of chitta and quieten them up in order to connect to the to the truer patterns of one's own working. And the whole of the Yoga Sutra, especially the first part, is a very first and the second chapters are very, very systematic manuals on how we can achieve this. Jairam Ratan first day had talked about all the different of the 7 different ways in which we can arrive at this certain quietening of the consciousness. He had talked of the parikarmas. So he says that how do we use these different techniques in order to quieten the chitta? Once that happens, then the Ritambhara Prajna automatically comes forth. With the coming in of the Ritambhara Prajna, there is a direct access or there is a direct understanding of the truth of things. When the chitta has been quietened down, when the knowledge that arises is no longer dependent on the old patterns of knowing things, when the samskaras that are there, there are no new samskaras that are being created, then there is less of a movement within the evolution, within the creations, within the manifestations of Prakriti. When that entire system has quietened down, because there is no generation of new patterns, there's no generation of new, let's say the new samskaras, I said, then one has direct access and the quietening of the system, or the nirodha. So as we move, we go from ekagra and then finally to nirodha with the niruddha chitta. So the niruddha chitta is not that there is absolutely no movement in that. It's a nirbija samadhi. So that nirbija samadhi is a samadhi where one doesn't have the seed for any new kind of thought patterns to emerge, where one is directly in the awareness of the Purusha consciousness and one is able to also express that in one's existence. So, with these few words, I think I would like to say that the Ritambhara Prajna therefore becomes the most important kind of state of awareness that one needs to arrive at. And with the arrival of that kind of an intelligence, the we enable the reflection of the Purusha to come directly on the being, and that therefore becomes the cause of liberation or kaivalya, because there is no new action that is being taken forth. It's not that we will cease to act, but the actions that will follow are not generative of new karmas, new samskaras, etc. So in this way, we can understand how the Ritambhara Prajna is a way, is an important key to the to liberation in itself. So I think with these few words, I've tried in my own way to explain the phenomenon of Ritam. And just the from Shobindu's thing, and I'll just probably end on this quotation from Shobindu. Stop that. How do I stop that now? So just coming back to the original thing here, I just like to read a quote from Sri Aurobindo where he says that what therefore is the object of the Vedic rishis? What were the Vedic rishis looking for? And the whole quest of the Vedic rishis has been represented in different ways in the different traditions that have followed from there. So he says this. He says that the central idea of the Vedic rishis was the transition of the human soul from a state of death to a state of immortality by the exchange of the falsehood for the truth, of divided and limited being for integrality and infinity. Death is the mortal state of matter and with mind and life involved in it. Immortality is a state of infinite being, consciousness and bliss. Man rises beyond the two firmaments, Rodasi, heaven and earth, mind and body, to the infinity of truth, or Mahas, and so to the divine bliss. This is the great passage discovered by the ancestors, the ancient rishis. So, with these words, I'd also like to say that in the Mundakopanishad, when they talk of they say that Satyam eva jayate, nan ritam, that na anritam was a very important part of that particular realization, because one will have freedom when one is able to look beyond the patterns of the anritam that is there constantly, which is promoted by our different vrittis within us. And finally, this experience of the quest for the Ritam is also reflected in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, where it says, Asatoma Sadgamaya, Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya, Mrityorma Amritangamaya. So, in this particular mantra, one can look at one can interpret it, which is the usual interpretation, which says that lead me from unreal to real, or lead me from falsehood to truth, lead me from darkness to light, lead me from death to immortality. But in these cases, we see that there is a kind of a movement from one state to another. Another interpretation of this, which goes in line with what I've been speaking, is which says that lead me to the truth of the untruth. Asataha can mean of or from. Lead me to the light of the darkness. Lead me to to the immortality of death. So it becomes this quest for how do we penetrate the negatives of each of these realities? How do we allow the noise of the structure to quieten down so that we are able to see the truth patterns behind each of them, and thereby experience bliss and immortality. So with these words, Bahu Dhanyavadaha.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anuradha. That was very enlightening looking at the comments that we have got so far. And we will take few questions now.
All right.
So Vaishali is asking, can we have some examples of practices for reaching rhythm?
So, as they have mentioned in the Yoga Sutras also, each of those practices that have been told before, so be it Maitri, Karuna, or if it is, the question of falling back on the prana. So, each of these practices are different ways by which we can start knowing ourselves. Similarly, what Vinayji talked yesterday about Ishwara Pranidhana, Tapah can be one, Ishwara Pranidhana can be another, Swadhyaya can be another, or just the Ashtanga yoga that Patanjali describes. Each of these practices are basically ways by which we can start identifying the complexities, the complex patterns that are there, and by reducing those patterns, the reduction of those patterns will allow the spontaneous reflection of the higher layers of consciousness on the mind stuff, which then enable us to see the underlying laws of things. If I have to give it to you in another more practical example, if you have to take a decision, one of the ways in which we take our decisions is when we are, uh, you know, our decisions are often based on the kleshas that have been identified. Why do we do whatever we do? So we do things we do because either we like it or we don't like it. Just the ignorance, just because it will increase our image, or maybe we're afraid of certain things. These are all factors that are the determinants of our decisions for doing things very often. So, if I have to recommend practical steps also from what the Yoga Sutra tells us, so first thing is to start identifying these different tendencies step by step. So they say that what are these movements? Are we always occupied? What is the nature of the thought processes going on in the mind? Are we carried away by future thoughts? Are we carried away? No, that is imaginations. Are we Are we functioning on false grounds, the Viparyaya, or are we functioning on Vikalpa, which is imagination? Are we functioning on the basis of Nidra? Or are we just functioning simply on the basis of, the inputs that we're getting from the senses, which is the pratyaksha, or not the pramanas, the different pramanas that are coming, are they the basis of our action? Or, so I'll take it in order. So are the pramanas, the different information that is coming to us from our sensory world, are those the basis? Are we working on false knowledge of things? We think this, but actually it is something else. Are we working on the basis of imaginations? Are we working on the basis of, things that don't exist and we are relying on that, like what happens in the Nidra state? Or are we basing our reactions or decisions on smritis, on memories? Start just understanding that. The more clarity one has on that, the more one can start opening up the consciousness to saying that, that there are certain patterns. How can we start reducing these delusional tendencies of the mind and trying to listen to probably greater truths that are there within us? So surrender, Ishwara Pranidhana, is quite a helpful one, where you say that, okay, this is my mind, this is what I want to do, but there is something which knows what the reality, because the Purusha Chaitanya is there, it knows, but can I quieten down my mind to listen to what indications are coming? Because that indication is there, but that indication gets blocked with the noise of our system. Can one listen to that? And then one can act. Another last one, very important, is the mantra. So our Omkara itself, the Pranava, which is recommended as the Sarvagya Bijam. So if one knows how to use the mantra, the Om, that's another major reset button for our system. So if we know how to quieten down the system using the Om, that can also be a very effective way to quieten down and know. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, definitely, Doctor. There is one more question from Mr. Raviraj Pardeshi. Do yogis travel to and fro into samadhi and non-samadhi state? Ritambhara Prajna and samadhi, are they same or different?
So are you saying Ritambhara Prajna is the same or are they different? So
samadhi, are they same or different?
No, Ritambhara Prajna is not yet. So Ritambhara Prajna is a kind of a samadhi, but it precedes that state of complete nirbija samadhi. Okay, so Ritambhara Prajna is still, there is a samskara that is happening because there is an action that is happening in that state of consciousness. With the nirbija samadhi, the final samadhi that happens, there is no kind of a movement at all. There is no new thing that happens there. This is how I understand it. I mean, I have to also admit limitations because these are experiences. Most of us, when we talk of this, we are stretching our own understanding to try and make sense of these experiences. But finally, these experiences are also based on what the person knows from Anubhava. So I think this is what it is, that the Ritambhara Prajna just precedes the experience of an absolute samadhi. But it is the closest approximation, I would say, to arriving at a state when the reflection is as complete as it could be on the chitta of the individual.
Thank you very much for that. I would like to read one compliment, one Mr. Tyagaraju has shared. Anuradha Madam has an interesting knack of drawing analogies between our psychological concepts with electronic gadgets. Kudos.
Yeah, Dhanyawad.
Yeah. And there is one more question. Does Ritambhara Prajna allows sadhakas for Kaivalya?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that, in fact, the Ritambhara Prajna is like I said, it is that stage of mind which allows the Purusha to reflect itself fully. So when the definition of yoga itself is yoga chitta vritti nirodha or yoga chitta vritti nirodha, that chitta vritti nirodha, when that happens, then the intelligence from that one has, the awareness that one has, is the awareness of the Purusha and its qualities in its fullness. And that is only when you have the Ritam and the experience of the Brihat. I'm talking across systems now. So when we are talking of the Ritam Brihat in the Vedic thing, it is this layer of our consciousness of Vijnana in the Panchakosha theory. So it is that layer which is completely aware of the highest truth, which then is reflected in the individual in its fullness. There is no distortion that is taking place at the manas level. So the manas acquires a quality where it can reflect. It is no longer, so that is why it is also called the samahita chitta. The samahita chitta implies that there is no movement, there is no turbulence due to the rajo and the tamogunas there.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. And shall we take few more questions, Dr. Anuradha?
I think if there is any one more, I can take that and then we can stop.
Okay. Srucha is asking, please teach us correct way to chant Om. And I have also heard you speak before. The way you teach chanting is different from the usual, I feel. And it's very authentic also is what I feel. So some Om chanting or some other chanting from you for us today.
Yes. So, I mean, I have to admit that very often some of the things that I share come from a different background. They're not necessarily from the very strict Shastric background because I've not had a very rigorous, training in that line. But truth, like I said, is not dependent on the training one has. Sometimes there are different sources which allow one to get glimpses or one understands the nature of certain things. And there is a certain, like I said, there is a certain resonance of truth in it, even if it has not followed any parampara in arriving at that. So the way I understand the Om, and which makes a lot of sense to me if one connects it to the definitions that are given to the sound across traditions, is this that the Om, the sound Om itself, like I say, is physiologically, it represents the entire range of the human vocal system, which goes from the A to the U, and the range from the A to the U covers the entire span of possible sounds that the human vocal system can produce. The O is the sound of the center, so you pluck the sound in the center and it will make that entire range vibrate. So therefore the Om and the M has the experiential quality of containing those sounds. So when you do the there is an experiential quality that is associated to these sounds. So when one does an then it holds the entire universe together. It sort of holds these vibrations together. So when one does the Om, what I would recommend is like it's a good idea to play with it a little bit. So you go from like so when you do that, you will start becoming conscious of the center point. So if you go like there are some who would do so if you have a string here and you're doing the R is here and the U is here, if you do an it's as if you're plucking the string closer to the R sound. If you do an O, you're plucking the string closer to the U sound. So in my understanding, you will get the maximum resonance of this string when you are plucking it right in the center. And that is something that one can try to practice really. Uh, the other the other understanding that has emerged in the course of practice is this, that because the sound Om is a sound that we tend to reproduce, it is a sound that is there already and we are merely reproducers of that sound. So if one knows again how to make the chitta, samahita chitta in a different sense, and listen to the Om somewhere in our own consciousness as you reproduce it. So to change from becoming the producer of the sound to the reproducer of the sound. and allow the mind consciousness to open up. It's like as if you have to visualize the entire universe in your head as you do the Om, and then you do the Om, and you will experience quite a different power that Om will unleash in the system. So maybe with these words, we can just try and do a practice of it. So what I'll recommend we do is we do an Aum and then an Om. But as you do the Aum, I'd like you to observe the center point of the Om, because when we do the Om, then try and find that point in your pronunciation of the sound. Asu. So let's try doing that once. Last time. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.
Mic on mute,
Ma'am,
Sarana.
you're on mute. Swarna ma'am.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anuradha ji. No words to explain how we felt when we chant like this. As you rightly said, we should be playing around with this for some time and then get the right chord to chant the Om for ourselves from within. That's what I feel.
If I can just add one thing. So, this is something that I've been discussing in my other circles. But this idea that because the sound Om is the neutral, in a sense, the neutral sound that we can make, it also has the potential of acting like a reset button for us. Because in our structure, which is a very noisy structure of vibrations and movements, etc., different kinds of movements, but the more we are able to put in neutral sounds, the more it enables the rest of the sounds to quieten down and resonate with that, which means it's almost like we would set our system to the factory mode of our creation, which is again the reflection of the Ritambhara Prajna and the, the Sarvagya Bijatvam and all of that that will emerge from there. Different ways of arriving at the similar experience.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for this wonderful session, Dr. Anuradha. Thank you is not the word which can conclude the session. As Swarup ji said, I mean, these lectures are not time bounded, these are all timeless. So it should be like going on and on. Thank you once again.
Oh,
To all our yes,
Yes,
please.
I was just saying, like to express my gratitude to Swarupji, to all of you again for this opportunity, to the audience for listening patiently. Some of them, like I said, are friends who've been there in different circles and they've also joined here. So thank you very much for reaching out and being part of this journey as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For our viewers, We have day 5 tomorrow. Dr. Vishwanath MV is going to enlighten us on decoding Chittavritti in yoga, Trisutri. That's a wonderful topic again for tomorrow. We have shared our feedback form with all of you. Please send all your feedbacks. We would like to enhance the quality of this webinar and more webinars to come. Thank you very much.
Namaste. Nirakula is a yogashala which firmly believes in promoting the ancient yogic tradition in the strictest sense and in its entirety. All our courses, may it be short-termed or long-termed, have in them the essence of mantra, tantra and yantra, guided by the principles of Yoga Parampara put forth by the Maharishis like Patanjali, Swarthyaya and others. Hence, at Nirakula, the courses have been formulated keeping in mind the vastness of yogic traditions. Our system is a rich blend of yoga, both as chikitsa and sadhana. We strive to use the principles of yoga to synchronize with nature as much to correct the imperfections of the body, breath, and mind. The following fundamental principles are firmly believed and practiced at Nirakula. Nurture excellent practitioners to carry forward the rich tradition of yoga into the future and to address the unending challenges facing humanity today. Create a strong urge amongst the practitioners to embrace the continuous cycle of physical, mental, and spiritual growth. A few uniqueness of our long-term programs like 200 hours and 300 hours teachers training programs are as follows. Our 200 hours teacher training course is integrated with 20 hours of spoken Sanskritam course. As part of the course, we provide participants an understanding of ancient Indian astronomy, history, and psychology. Our 300 hours teacher training course covers a plethora of subjects including Swara Yoga, Nada Yoga, Mantra Yoga, Yoga philosophy, and psychology, a teaching methodology based on ancient Indian scriptures. This program opens up the participants towards ideas least discussed in academics like marriage, parenting, nutritious food that strengthens spiritual journey. During this program, we take students out to different parts of India and help the participants to realize as to how yoga has been internalized in our culture for more than 5,000 documented years. We have teachers to teach pratyahara and dharana practically. Our graduation day is based purely on the principles of ancient Indian idea of convocation. Namaste.